Today, inshallah, we are going to complete chapter 9. And I will come back quickly to the last point that we discussed in the last class. Right? I think that the last point in the last class was related to the aggregate, the long term or the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply as well as the aggregate demand. And the potential GDP in the long term and the short term. As you see in this diagram, we have the equilibrium. This is the aggregates, the long run aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand. The equilibrium is at point E here when the aggregate demand curve intersects the short run and long run aggregate supply curve. As we mentioned that if the government use expansion policy, whether expansion fiscal or monetary policy, this leads to encourage or increase the aggregate demand. صح? Whether if we use an expansion fiscal or expansion monetary, in this case, a policy in this case, the aggregate demand will shift to the right. So, which leads to a rightward shifting and the aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, which means we have a new equilibrium point here, E1, E2, the prices would increase from point P1 to P2. In this case, Y would increase from Y1 to Y2. Right? Okay? When the prices increase, so increasing the money supply or increasing the government spending. So here we're talking about the expansion policy, whether monetary or fiscal. This leads to, or let's analyze, increasing the money supply leads to what? Decreasing R, increase I, increase aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. So Y would increase from Y1 to Y2, right? But the increasing the aggregate demand creates what? Increasing the price levels, or the overall price level would increase. So we have increasing the prices leads to increasing the cost of production. Increase the wages, the cost of production increased, which means a decreasing in the aggregate supply. So there is what? A leftward shifting in the aggregate supply curve, right? So there is a leftward shifting from to the aggregate supply 1, from the aggregate supply 1 to aggregate supply 2. So in this case, the prices would increase from P2 to P3 and Y would decline from Y2 to Y1, which is the potential GDP. هلا شو اللي لاحظناه انه الواي increased بعدين رجع decreased. So as you see, there is a leftward shifting for the aggregate supply from aggregate supply 1 to 2, which means increasing the prices. طب which is better for us? Y1 without increasing the prices, or Y1, the Y1 here is the potential GDP. يعني أقصى حاجة ممكن نوصلها هو Y1. صحيح إنه ال Y1 increase بعدين then decrease. Which is better for us, for the economy? Y1 without increasing the prices or without inflation, or Y1 with inflation? Without inflation, exactly. تمام? إذن Y1 here for the first case at E1 is called the potential GDP without inflation. صح؟ هلا Y1 here, if the aggregate demand increased and then aggregate supply declined, this means we will reach or we will come back to the capacity or the full capacity utilization or the potential GDP, but we have increasing the prices, which means we have a potential GDP with increasing the prices without a change in aggregate output, which means potential GDP with inflation. So we would prefer to work at Y1 without inflation. صح؟ without increasing the prices. إذا وصلنا إحنا أصلا ل A1 here خلاص مش لازم إنه أنا أروح أعمل increasing the money supply or using an expansionary fiscal or monetary policy, because here the increasing the money supply or increasing the government spending leads to increasing aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and then backward shifting في aggregate supply, وبالتالي prices هتطلع. إذن الأفضل بالنسبة لي هو أن أنا أشتغل بدون increasing the prices. مثلا أنا finally in the long term راجع للنقطة هاي. طب أروح على النقطة E1 or to E3. أنا which is better for me, E1 or E3? E1 is better than E3 because E1 means I will produce at Y1, right? The aggregate output would be Y1 with the price of P1, but E3 means the same aggregate output with higher price levels. مظبوط؟ Let's go to another issue. As we mentioned before, that the aggregate supply curve, we can divide the aggregate supply curve into two parts. Number one, as you see, we have two parts for the aggregate supply curve. The first part is the short run and the long term. In the short run, or the very short run, if we use an expansionary policy, expansionary fiscal policy, or expansionary monetary policy, this leads to what? This leads to a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand node to aggregate demand 1, which means there is an increasing in Y with larger than the increasing in the prices. So in this case, in the short run, we have, if we use an expansionary fiscal policy or expansionary monetary policy, this leads to increasing the aggregate demand from aggregate demand node to aggregate demand 1. So we have a new equilibrium point from A to A dash. مظبوط? This leads to increasing the prices from B node to P1, increasing from Y to Y node to Y1. مظبوط؟ مين اللي change فيه أعلى, Y or the prices? Exactly. So in this case, the increasing and the aggregate output level is larger than the increasing the price level. So in this case, the expansionary policy is effective. مظبوط؟ طيب the crowding out in this case بيكون قليل ولا كبير؟ قليل, exactly. Is this small? مظبوط ولا لا؟ صح؟ لأنه effective, وبالتالي increasing the aggregate output is larger than. طب why is the change, or does the change in aggregate output is larger than the change in the prices here? Okay. Exactly, but why? My question is why? In the short run here, why does the change in Y is larger than the change in the price level? Exactly, thank you. Because the slope of aggregate supply curve in the short run and the very short run is small, or it should be more elastic than the long run period or stage. صح? Exactly, the elasticity that you have studied in the microeconomics. تمام؟ طيب, let's go. On the steep portion of the aggregate curve or aggregate supply curve, the expansionary or the expansionary policy does not work well. هلا تعالوا هنا في long run, or when the aggregate supply curve is steep or the steeper here. it's close to the vertical line. So in this case here, suppose there is, or we use an expansionary policy. This leads to what? A small increasing in Y and large increasing in prices, because the slope of the aggregate supply curve is close to a vertical line. But in this case, what do you see? What about the crowding out effect and the planned investment? We have a large crowding out, or big crowding out, and the planned investment. Yes, yes, yes. So, as you see, in the advanced stages, or the long term, the aggregate supply curve would be more steeper or steeper. So in this case, if we use an expansionary fiscal policy, this leads to a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand no to aggregate demand 1. And we have a new equilibrium point, P no, P to P dash, which means, or we have a larger increasing in the prices, or inflation, with a small increasing in the aggregate output. So, in this case, the expansionary policy is what? Is ineffective or less effective. So, لا السياسة المالية ولا النقدية فعالين في هذه الحالة، مظبوط ولا لا؟ طيب. What about the multiplier? In this case, فاكرين المالتيبلاير؟ اللي هو دلتا واي multiplier, the government spending multiplier delta y over delta g. هلا الزياده اللي صارت في الجفرمنت سبيندنج زادت الواي بنسبه بسيطه جدا، صح؟ مظبوط؟ يعني سبوز انه احنا زدنا الجفرمنت سبيندنج، الواي ممكن تزيد بحاجه بسيطه، small. So the multiplier is close to be zero in this case. إذا كان vertical line, for sure the multiplier would be zero. صح؟ إنه هذا الكلام إنه on the steep portion of the aggregate supply curve, the expansion policy does not work well, and the multiplier is close to zero. If the aggregate supply curve is a vertical line, in this case, the increasing the government spending leads to increasing aggregate demand. Suppose here we would like to increase or we use an expansion fiscal policy. Suppose from B dash to B2 or B3, this is the aggregate demand 3. Suppose that the government used an expansion fiscal policy. This leads to what? Increasing aggregate, suppose we use an expansion fiscal policy by increasing the government spending. This leads to increasing aggregate expenditure or increasing aggregate demand. So we will shift, or there is a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 3, right? Which means we have increasing in the prices without a change in the aggregate demand, the aggregate output. So we will still, there is no change in the aggregate output. So we will, Y would be constant at Y1, مظبوط؟ طب في هاي الحالة the multiplier would be how much? Zero, exactly, because here, as we mentioned that the multiplier equals delta Y over delta G. So suppose that the government spending increased by $100 million and the delta Y would not change, zero. 0 over $100 million equals 0. So the multiplier would be 0. صح? So in this case, we have only a changes and or increasing the price levels or inflation. تمام؟ وهذه المنطقة بسموها inflationary gap. فجوة تضخمية. تمام؟ هذا جايين عليها لقيت إن شاء الله. So when the economy works at or operating at the capacity. هنا موضوع الكاباسيتي at P dash, we have the capacity or the full capacity. And increasing or using an expansion fiscal or a monetary policy leads to increasing the prices only without a change in Y. But when we work close to the capacity, يعني قريبين من الكاباسيتي, in this case the expansion of fiscal policy leads to increasing the prices with a smaller change in Y, or a smaller change in the aggregate output. مين مش فاهم أعيد له في هذه الجزئية؟ واضحة؟ طب احكي عربي ولا نص؟ تمام. أنا أحكي إنجليزي أحسن؟ أوكي. طيب. طيب. So as you see, if the aggregate supply curve is a vertical in the long term, إذا كان نعمل diagram هيك. If the aggregate supply curve is a vertical line, in this case, neither the monetary policy nor the fiscal policy has any effect on the aggregate output. مظبوط؟ Hey, in the long term, aggregate supply is a vertical line here. The increasing or the using an expansionary fiscal policy or the expansionary monetary policy, this leads to increasing in the prices, ED1, ED2, which means there we have increasing in the prices without a change in Y. So neither the monetary policy nor the fiscal policy is effective or has an effect on the aggregate output. مظبوط؟ طب في هاي الحالة multiplier as we mentioned is zero. So the multiplier, or in the long term or the long run, the multiplier effect of the change in government spending or taxes on the aggregate output is zero. And the crowding out is what? Full. We have a full crowding out. مظبوط؟ لأنه كل الزيادات اللي صارت في الناتج هلقيت حنجيين عليه هذا حيعمل backward مرة ثانية. صح؟ Let's go to this diagram. According to the Keynesian theory, the aggregate supply curve has two parts, flat or horizontal line and then vertical line. هلا بنحكي عن very short run and long run. تمام؟ خلينا نعمل الرسمة هنا وبعدين نعمل analysis. Okay? So according to the Keynesian view, let's analyze the policy effect or the policy's effects on the aggregate output. According to the Keynesian view, we have two diagrams or two figures. This is the aggregate supply curve. Aggregate supply curve, horizontal and then vertical, right? Suppose this is, where is the capacity point? The full capacity utilization. Suppose it's a point E1 or E. Here we will analyze. This is why aggregate expenditure 1, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. I suppose this is the E1, and here this is the aggregate demand 1. Prices Y, aggregate expenditure Y. تمام? Suppose that in the first diagram, the equilibrium occurs when the aggregate expenditure 1 intersects Y. صح؟ تمام؟ طيب, here, this is E1. Let's say the equilibrium here occurs when aggregate supply intersects the aggregate demand. مظبوط? Now suppose that the government used an expansionary fiscal policy or monetary policy. Suppose that the government used an expansionary policy by increasing G. Increasing G leads to increasing aggregate expenditure. Then increasing aggregate demand or aggregate demand, and then increasing Y. صح? So here we have what? Upward shifting of the aggregate expenditure function and increasing the aggregate demand. So suppose this is aggregate demand 2. Here we have E2. What do you see? This is P1 and P2, Y1. This is Y1, Y2. صح? Or YF. Suppose in YF here. Y. Okay, Y2. So, the using of an expansionary fiscal policy leads to increasing aggregate demand from or a rightward shifting of the aggregate demand from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2. At the same time, the aggregate expenditure function increase and shift to the upward. There is upward shifting, and the aggregate expenditure 2. This is aggregate expenditure 2. Sorry, Y. شو اللي صار؟ aggregate expenditure وين راح؟ upward shifting. بقى جاي بشكل parallel to the previous case. This is aggregate expenditure 2. This is E2. Right? تمام؟ هذا شو يعمل في الواي؟ This is Y1 Y2. مظبوط؟ طيب هنا شو اللي صار؟ البرايسز ما تغيرتش. Remains constant P1 P2. P1 equals P2. صح؟ طيب now the capacity reach at point E2 here. مظبوط؟ هذا الكاباسيتي or full capacity utilization. Suppose انه الجفرمنت راحت شو عامله؟ increasing its spending once again. راحوا عاملين زياده في aggregate demand or aggregate government spending once again. Leads to increasing aggregate expenditure, increase aggregate demand. But what do you see for the aggregate up? هلا شو اللي بصير؟ aggregate demand will shift to the right once again. AD3. تمام؟ شو اللي صار؟ This is A3. The prices increase from B2 to B3 without a change in Y. In the long term, this is Y3. طب نيجي للرسم الثاني نشوف شو اللي صار فيها. الانكريزنج اللي صار في الاجريجيت ديماند اور اجريجيت اكسبنديتشر عمل upward shifting للفانكشن. صح؟ اذا صار في عندي نعمله باللون الازرق هيك. This is aggregate expenditure 3. وين جينا؟ Y increase to Y3. مظبوط؟ صح؟ طيب هلا هذه المنطقة this is E3 صار في عندي increasing or upward shifting في aggregate expenditure من aggregate expenditure 2 ل aggregate expenditure 3. صح؟ بس قلنا إنه في عندي full crowding out بعد full capacity utilization. هذا بعد النقطة هاي هيك بعد E2 صحيح صار في عندي الانكريزنج اللي صار في الاجريجيت اكسبندتشر زود الناتج بس الناتج يرجع ل Y2 لأنه في عندي فولي كراودينج اوت. مظبوط؟ وهذا اسمه إذا حيرجع مرة ثانية ينزل الاجريجيت اكسبندتشر من اجريجيت اكسبندتشر 3 إلى اجريجيت اكسبندتشر 2 due to the crowding out effect اللي هو الفولي كراودينج اوت. إذا الفولي كراودينج اوت وين رجعني؟ رجعني from aggregate expenditure 3 إلى aggregate expenditure 2. إذا وين البوتنشال جي دي بي في هذا الحالة؟ Y2 exactly thank you. Y2 صحيح أنا رحت زدت ل Y3 here but the finally I came back to Y2. هذه المنطقة between E2 to E3 هذه بيسموها الانفليشنري جاب. صح؟ هذه المنطقة هيك أو من هنا from E2 to E3 is the inflationary gap لأنه the prices طلعت without a change in Y. مظبوط؟ هلا عدم الزيادة في الواي نتيجتها إيش؟ أو بسبب شو؟ What are the main causes of تمام and the multiplier is 0 exactly and we have a fully crowding out. صح؟ مين مش فاهم أعيد له شباب؟ إذا لو رجعنا if we came back here this is the original equilibrium point aggregate demand 1 intersects the aggregate supply. And here we have E1. This is E1. And the aggregate output is Y1. Tamam? The expansionary policy leads to increasing or a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, right? Which leads to an upward shifting of the aggregate expenditure from aggregate expenditure 1 to aggregate expenditure 2, which means we have, this is E1, E2, we have a new equilibrium point, and the Y increased to YF. YF here, right? Additional expansionary fiscal policy or monetary policy leads, leads to upward shifting of the aggregate expenditure to aggregate expenditure 3. Here we have a new equilibrium point, Y3, right? But the fully crowding out here when the aggregate supply is averted and we have a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve from 2 to 3 means or leads to increasing the prices from B1 to P3. Here P1 equals P2, right? There is an upward shift or increasing the prices without changing Y. So Y would decline to YF. So YF is what? The potential GDP in the long term, right? هذا أقصى حد ممكن يوصل إلى الناتج، حتى ولو زاد حيرجع مرة ثانية. تمام؟ هاي المنطقة هيك is inflationary gap لأنه هي مجرد زيادات في الأسعار. صح؟ طيب. If you remember in chapter 1 we discussed the concept of inflation, which is what? The increase in the overall price limits with sustained inflation as occurs when the overall price level continues to rise over some further long in the long term, right? We have two types of inflation. Number one, it's called the demand pull inflation. تضخم اللي جاي نتيجة الطلب بيزيد وبالتالي عمليا البرايسز بتطلع. صح؟ شباب, we have two types of inflation. Number one, it's called demand pull inflation, and the second is cost push inflation or supply side inflation. And demand pull inflation means increasing the aggregate demand, which leads to increasing the prices. يعني شو اللي خلى انه الاجريجيت ديماند يزيد او شو اللي خلى البرايسز تزيد الانفليشن يزيد الاجريجيت ديماند increase maybe by using as a result or due to the expansion policy or expansion fiscal or expansionary monetary policy, right? What about the cost push inflation? شو سبب انه البرايسز طلعت؟ increasing the cost of production. مظبوط؟ Increasing the cost of production, like increasing the prices of inputs, increase the wages, leads to what? Leads to decrease the exactly the prices would increase. Tamam. So we have a leftward shifting in the aggregate supply curve, which means increasing the prices from. We have a new equilibrium point from E1 to E2, which means increasing the prices from P note to P1. So we have two types of inflation. Number one, اللي هو demand pull inflation والcost push inflation or supply side inflation. تمام؟ صعب الأمور؟ تمام حلو. Let's go to the stagflation. شو stagflation? Exactly. We have increasing the prices or inflation and increasing and the aggregate the unemployment rate at the same time. مظبوط؟ مش هيك أخذنا الديفينيشن تبعه في chapter 1. خلينا نطبقه هنا. As we mentioned before, when the government used an expansionary fiscal policy, this leads to increasing the aggregate demand. مظبوط؟ So let's analyze this stagflation case. And the first, suppose that the government used an expansionary fiscal policy by increasing the government spending. This leads to what? Increasing aggregate demand. So there is a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve. وبالتالي خلينا نعمل هيك. This is aggregate supply, aggregate demand, 1, E1, P1, Y1. This is prices, Y. This is the origin. Now suppose that the government used an expansionary fiscal policy by increasing the government spending or decreasing the taxes. This leads to a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand to aggregate demand 2. What would happen to the prices and what? The prices would increase to B2, Y2, right? This is E2. When the price is increased, this leads to what? Increase the wages, the cost, increase the cost of production, decrease aggregate supply. So there is a leftward shifting, and this is the first case, increasing aggregate demand. And we have a leftward shifting in the aggregate supply curve to aggregate supply 2. So what do you see? To B3 we have increasing in the prices. وبالتالي الناتج رجع انخفض من وين؟ from Y2 to Y3. هلا الانكريزنج في البرايس from B1 to B2 to P3 شو اسمه هذا؟ inflation. طيب الديكريزنج اللي صار في الاجريجيت اوتبوت هذا تخفيض الناتج شو معناه؟ انه البطاله زادت. Exactly. إذن هذا الانكريزنج في البرايسز from P1 to B3 شو معناه؟ inflation. At the same time, yes.
لما انتقلت من B1 ل B2 زاد طبعا الواي، بس لما راح ل 3 طب رجع الواي كيف صار؟
الرجوع اللي صار في الواي هذا شو معناه from Y2 to Y3؟ إنه الكوست اوف برودكشن طلع. صار في عندي cost push inflation or supply side inflation. شو اللي صار؟ هلا الارتفاع اللي صار في الاسعار شو عمل؟ increased في الويجز. مظبوط؟ زياده في الويجز شو عملت؟ في الكوست اوف برودكشن زودت الكوست اوف برودكشن، وبالتالي الابيليتي تبع البروديوسرز انه ينتجوا more and more would decline. وبالتالي الاجريجيت سبلاي would decline. So there is a backward shifting or a leftward shifting في الاجريجيت سبلاي curve from aggregate supply 1 to aggregate supply 2. Right? طيب شو عمل هذا؟ This is E3. شو اللي عمل؟ عملنا backward shifting في الاجريجيت سبلاي، البرايسز طلعت والواي نزل. هلا increasing في البرايسز شو معنى؟ What's the meaning of increasing the prices? Inflation plus decreasing اللي صار في الواي from Y2 to Y3. الناتج لما بينزل شو بصير في unemployment؟ معناه this means انه unemployment rate increased. So this means we have increasing in the unemployment rate, which is a stagflation. واضحة؟ إذن the stagflation means increasing in the price, the overall price levels, and increasing and for the unemployment at the same time. تمام؟ مين أعيد له مش فاهم أوضح له شيء؟ تمام؟ أوكي. Yes. Yes, the potential is no Y3. The potential GDP is Y3. هذا potential with inflation. Potential without inflation Y1. صح؟ مظبوط لأنه الناتج هنا increase and then decline. This is in the long term. طيب. Could the change enough to have, okay. Expectation and inflation. العلاقة ما بين expectation about the future or expectation about something and inflation؟ هلا expectations about the changes and future prices may affect current decisions. إذا أنا بتوقع إنه الأسعار حترتفع خلال الفترة الجاية، شو اللي بيعمل؟ شو اللي بصير عندي؟ firms may raise their prices in expectation of competitors doing and the competitors will do the same. إذا مؤسسة بتتوقع إنه الأسعار بتطلع وحدا راح رفع الأسعار، الكل بيرفع الأسعار. هذا واحد، مظبوط. اثنين، workers, as we mentioned before, the workers may ask for higher wages because the prices مالها or they expect the higher inflation in the future. إذا بتوقعوا إنه إذا العمال بيتوقعوا إنه البرايسز حتطلع حيروحوا يطلبوا أجور أعلى. That's it. طيب. Let's go to the hyperinflation. شو hyperinflation? The rapid increase in the overall price levels in the long term. مظبوط؟ Quickly. The prices بتطلع بسرعة. So, here as you see, the equilibrium occurs when aggregate demand not intersects the aggregate supply. Suppose إنه في عنا expansion fiscal policy. The increasing in government spending with or without a change in monetary policy شو بتعمل؟ Increase aggregate demand. So there is a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve. تمام؟ شو بصير في البرايسز would increase. اعمل كمان مرة increasing في aggregate demand. To aggregate demand 2. Increasing aggregate demand 3. So we have a rapid increase in the overall price levels due to the increasing and the aggregate the government spending without a change in the monetary policy. طب في هاي الحالة the crowding out شو ماله؟ طبعا هذا this leads to an increase in the interest rate and the crowding out of the planned investment. هلا شوف نعمل الاناليسيس نشوف شو اللي صار. The increasing in the government spending شو عمل؟ without a change في monetary policy شو عمل؟ increase the aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure مظبوط؟ which leads to increasing Y. Increased money demand, increased R. إذن هذا شو عمل؟ increasing في الR واللي عمل decreasing في الI وهذا اسمه crowding out, so the crowding out would increase. مظبوط؟ هذا الاناليسيس تبع الدياجرام هذا. هذا نفس the same. والسلايد بيقول انه an increase in the government spending with money supply constants will shift the aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2 and so on. Although not shown in the figure, this leads to an increase in the interest rate. هذا اللي حللناه وبالتالي the crowding out would increase. The crowding out and the planned investment would increase. طب خلينا أشوف إنه suppose there is a change in the money supply or the monetary policy. What would happen? تمام. Okay. هلا without a change شو عمل؟ عملنا hyperinflation. If the money supply remains constant without a change يعني ما غيروش في يأثروا على سعر الفائدة. Suppose we use an expansion fiscal policy. تمام؟ هذا شو عمل؟ رفع الانترست ريت صح؟ وخلق مشكلة الكراودينج اوت. مظبوط ولا لا؟ هلا البرايسز شو بصير فيها؟ كل ما بيزيد الجفرمنت سبيندينج الاجريجيت demand would increase, which means we have a rapid increasing in the price levels. مظبوط؟ هذا without intervention by the central bank to increase the money supply. هلا بدناش نلغي without اللي هو الغاء بدون الغاء اثر الانترست ريت على الانفستمنت. طب خلينا نشوف لو راح السنترال بانك مزود الماني سبلاي، يعني صارت في عندي increasing هنا في الاجريجيت demand from aggregate demand no to aggregate demand 1 to 2 to 3. خلينا without a change in money supply. بس خلينا نشوف انهم راحوا بدهم يلغوا تاثير الار. احنا مشكلتنا في الكراودنج اوت وين؟ انه الانترست ريت طلع وبالتالي نزل الاجريجيت البلاند انفستمنت وبالتالي نزل الواي، صح؟ هل قد خلينا نشوف انه عشان يلغوا تاثير الار شو قلنا بنعمل في الموني سبلاي؟ we have to increase the money supply. هلا اذا بتتذكروا عشان نلغي موضوع الكراودنج اوت لازم نعمل شو؟ نزود الموني سبلاي. لانه هو الاشكاليه وين كانت عندنا؟ خلينا ارجعكم شويه لموضوع الموني سبلاي والموني ديماند. This is the money supply 1 money demand 1. هذا بدي ارجعكم شويه عشان قبل ما افوت على النقطه هاي. This is E1 R1 QM1. تمام. هلا في الحاله هذه increasing the government spending شو عملنا increasing في الماني ديماند وبالتالي there is a rightward shifting in the money demand curve، صح؟ شو عمل فيه؟ to MD2 رفع الانترست ريت from R1 to R2، صح؟ وهذا اللي عمل لي مشكله الكراودينج اوتس، مظبوط؟ صح؟ هلا كيف قلنا how could we cancel the effect of interest rate? Exactly, we have to increase the money supply from money supply 1 to money supply 2 وبالتالي بأثبت عند interest rate شو R1 this is R3 equals R1. عشان ألغي التأثير لازم أزود الموني سبلاي. فخلينا نشوف if the central bank or the Federal Reserve System in this case used an expansionary monetary policy by increasing the money supply شو اللي بصير في البرايسز؟ خلينا نشوف. Yes مين عندهم؟ Yes محمد you have. طيب so let's use or let's assume that the central bank used an expansionary monetary policy by increasing the money supply to what? To cancel the effect of interest rate. بدنا نشوف اللي راحوا بدهم يدخلوا السنترال بانك عشان يلغي الكراودينج اوت by decreasing or يعني يرجع يلغي تاثير الانترست ريت. شو اللي بصير؟ هلا increasing money supply شو بيعمل؟ decreasing the interest rate increase I increase aggregate expenditure or increase aggregate demand. So in this case the aggregate demand would increase once again. شو اللي حيصير؟ The prices would increase. Hyperinflation exactly. We have a hyperinflation. إذا بعد الفول كاباسيتي هذا هيك بيكون أصلا ال fiscal policy neither the fiscal policy nor the monetary policy is effective. صح؟ لأنه خربوا الدنيا هيك. مظبوط ولا لا؟ لأنه خربت هيك لأنه الزيادات اللي صارت في الفيسكال بوليسي الاكسبانشن فيسكال بوليسي شو عملت في البرايسز؟ طلعته. والاكسبانشن المونيتري بوليسي increase the prices. صح؟ واضحة ولا فيها مشاكل؟ ايه؟ طب مين حابب اعيد له الجزئية والموضوع هذا؟ إذا if the federal الحل انه يرجع لوين؟ انه اذا كنا بعد الفول كاباسيتي مفروض انه ما استخدمش اكسبانشن فيسكال ولا اكسبانشن مونيتري بوليسي.
بس يعني هذا ممكن يلعب فيها
شوف no it's يعني the increasing the government spending is ineffective so they will spend money without effects without impacts on the economy. So يعني okay it will create a budget deficit, it will create increasing the inflation rate without impacts, without positive impacts. So as you see, if the federal tries to keep the interest rate unchanged by increasing the money supply هذا التحليل اللي عملناه لقيت انهم بدهم يثبتوا سعر الفائده by increasing the money supply the aggregate demand curve will shift farther and farther to the right. The result would be a sustained inflation اللي هو sustained inflation or hyperinflation. يعطيكم العافية.